I'm always letting everyone down. I'm always letting everyone know I'm down. I'm always letting everyone down.
Hello everybody, and welcome to Experimental Game Design, Critical Making and Playable Ideologies. My name is Stefano. You can find my email address below here, of course. And well, I'm recording this first session on the 21st of December 2020. We are still under a sort of pandemic kind of rules and regulation, meaning that I cannot give this class live. And well, I thought I would use this opportunity to make an online course to begin with. So this course in particular, Experimental Game Design, in a way presupposes that you have taken my game design class in the previous semester or somewhere in your life, but it doesn't require it. So it's a self-standing course. Many topics will in a way connect and overlap. In case you've taken the course, you will notice that, and you probably will be able to join the dots. For the ones who didn't take it, welcome, and I hope you will enjoy this ride. Class 1 is called A Telescope for the Mind, and it starts right now. The title A Telescope for the Mind is not mine. I actually borrowed it from British linguist Margaret Masterman, who used it in 1962 in a Times literary supplement on a Sunday. In that article, she compared the potential of computers to transform our conception of the world to the invention of the telescope. In the 17th century, Masterman claims, the invention of the telescope did not only lead to scientific discoveries in related fields to the invention of the telescope itself. Not only it extended our understanding of optics or geography, for example, but also asked human beings to reformulate an understanding of their position within the cosmos and in the way they're related to one another. In other words, it led to more substantial and widespread systemic transformations than just its functional invention. Following Masterman, in this course I will also look at the computer and its invention from that point of view, from that transformative perspective. So I'm going to focus not only in these scientific advantages that it led to, but in its inevitable philosophical and sociological impact. In particular, I'm not going to focus on computers as a whole, as an entire ecosystem of technologies and relations, but rather on a particular application of digital computation. That is, on the possibility of computers to disclose the interactive experience of virtual worlds. By virtual world, I mean persistent interactive environments that can be explored in a more or less embodied fashion through a number of computer-supported interfaces and feedback systems. So I'm going to look in this set of classes, and this is my promise as a professor, to virtual worlds, especially playful ones, the ones of video games, and their possibility to disclose the interactive experience of virtual worlds. Once we've done that, we're going to look into the social, psychological, and ideological, in particular, effect of those experiences. That promise will need to be fulfilled by yours truly in a way that is, to a degree, self-referential. This course is very much a Stefano kind of course, meaning that I will leverage my experience and my interest to show you something more about virtual worlds and digital games. In doing so, as I said, I will frequently cite my work and those of the people in the community of philosophy of computer games and game studies, and even philosophy proper, that share these kind of interests. So in the second class, we will need to read a paper of mine and discuss ideology and games from that particular framework. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves for now. As a little caveat, when I talk about virtual worlds, I'm not necessarily talking about virtual reality or worlds experienced through virtual reality gear. I'm talking about any sort of setup of that kind that can be experienced through a computer. So any experience that presents itself as a worldly or world-like experience that we can only access and that are supported by the digital medium, which include video games, archaeological reproduction, flight simulators, artificial reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, surgical simulation, flight simulation, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily a point that is limited to computer games alone. Having done this necessary premise, in which I introduced the very, very rough outline of the course, let's start with the first installment of this series, A Telescope for the Mind. To start with, I want to introduce the concept of what an ideology is. In case you have taken my previous course, you know that we've explored this notion in some detail in class number 4, but we're going to start again now. In this series of lectures, I will treat an ideology in a very sort of like nominal and, enough shared kind of way, according to which an ideology is a system of beliefs that constitutes one's goals and determines one's actions. And I'm talking, for example, about certain game design decisions or certain ways to play a game. Generally, we understand ideologies as ideas that are accepted and proposed by the dominant classes of a society and are then shared by its members in often implicit, silent ways. A simpler way perhaps to define the same notion is saying that an ideology is a set of socially shared beliefs that contribute in constituting one's goals and determining one's actions. It's a bit of a repetition, but I wanted to have it down in at least another way. And so as game designers, when we're crafting the logical systems within a game, or we determine its objectives and the rules under which our players are going to be playing, it is inevitable that some of the ideologies that define us and our point of view and our place in the world contribute to the choices that we make as designers. And by doing so, we are often unaware that such beliefs have a role in how we set up these kind of worlds. So one of the first steps to make here is, in a way, starting to have a critical attitude towards ideologies and try to understand what we do in games, even when we do not know or think we're doing anything within games of an ideological kind. As I mentioned already, there was an entire class dedicated to that in one of my previous courses. In case you're interested, there's going to be a link in the description of this video linking to that particular class. It's a 1 hour long class that looks at how designers sometimes implicitly and perhaps unknowingly pour and craft ideologies and ideological positions within their games. If you don't remember that class, or if you're interested, once again, I encourage you to look into that. Let me repeat that ideologies are understood here as ideas accepted and proposed by the dominant classes of a society that are then shared by its members in often implicit ways. That is, however, not always true. There are, in fact, ideologies which are completely explicit. Take, for example, the 10 commandments of the Christian religion, right? The kind of values and expected behaviors that you are to adopt and embrace as a religious person are spelled out one by one. Of course, you could say there's still a degree of interpretation and a bit of freedom in taking some or all of them in. However, the ideologies are put forward, are front-loaded when you decide to be a religious person. Another example in which a set of ideologies and set of behavior, values, and expectations are projected onto a member of a certain society in an explicit fashion is, for example, the case of the law, right? If you take the law, like manuals and constitutions and regulations that determine a societal behavior are explicitly stated. You are, as a member of society, well aware of the ways in which you're expected to behave and function within that society. Another clear way in which ideological behavior in a way structure your behavior and values and aspiration within a world in a way that is explicit are the rules of a game, right? Within that tiny little environment, your behavior and your goals are set for you and in a way explicitly presented to the player. At least this is what happens in most cases in board games, right? In games that are normally approached from a rule perspective. It is perhaps a bit different in video games, but I will not go there just yet. So, ideologies. As I said, many of them are presented explicitly, but the majority of them is something that we are in a way constantly under and internalized in a way that is implicit. Now, what you see here is a set of screenshots from a movie called They Live, which I propose a link to you below the image. You see the picture here. I cannot show you the video directly because that would put me in a copyright strike with YouTube, but I invite you to stop my video and watch 5 minutes of They Live. The reason why I want you to watch it is that it's often used to explain ideological behavior and the implicitness or the implicit nature of ideologies. Please stop now and watch the video. As you saw in the movie, many of the ways in which an individual, a subject, is formed by society and is invited to behave in particular ways, to have particular desires, to conform to particular standards, are often silent, implicit, almost subtle, you know what I'm saying, like sneakily communicated through a number of different things, including advertisement, media, and so on and so forth. This is a very interesting process which I'm going to discuss in the next slide, but I want to tell you that there's more about this movie, and later in this class we're going to see more about its meaning and so on. So hold on to your chairs and don't lose faith just yet. To recap what we've said until now, ideologies are groups of ideas, systems of ideas that tend to have to do with society, economics, law, religion, in general, people's behavior and what they value, what they aspire to, and how their behavior is arranged around those values and aspirations. These ideologies are normally shared by people within the same political system. For example, people within a certain party tend to, in a way, align to the same desires and goals and views. But not only political systems or political parties, but also religious communities, families, institutions, and so on and so forth. Even here at the Institute of Digital Games, we see games in a particularly ideological way, right? And we tend to talk about game in a certain fashion. So our discourse on game, the language we use, the perspectives we present tend to be of a certain kind. Within those circles, regardless of their being political, religious, or so on, ideologies are repeated and normalized through a variety of media and institutions, through the national radio, the rituals at the mosques, university and university institutions like I just mentioned, through games and other forms of media. When I say normalized, which you see is a word that I highlighted in blue, I mean that they are repeated enough times and presented as normal and desirable to an extent that people start to believe that that is, of course, the way things are, and start to internalize those same values themselves. So in a way, like institutions, radio, media forms, religious sort of aggregations and so on and so forth, function as technologies that inject us with ideologies and normalize them, which is to say, make them appear to us as the way the world is, as a behavior that is natural to everybody and should be natural for everybody. This process of normalization, let me repeat it once again, refers to the construction of an ideal set of beliefs or a code of conduct or shared values that is, perhaps with an unhappy or non-super precise metaphor, comparable to, say, like updating or installing the ideological software into an individual's hardware or in the societal hardware as a whole. So it's a way to indoctrinate somebody, so to speak. So to convince somebody through rhetorics, metaphors, tales, cautionary tales, repetitions, poems, psalms, and so on and so forth, of something. This idea that the individual is in a way shaped and transformed through those activities is central to the work of French sociologist and philosopher Michel Foucault. Especially it is crucial to his 1975 book Discipline and Punish, in which he, in a way, enumerates and explains how many of the social behaviors are meant to exactly shape, guide, or exclude certain behaviors and certain people from those ideological groups, those groups of power, those groups of belonging. As also explained by Foucault, but not only, this process of normalization, which I also called like indoctrination or formation of the subject or changing of the mind of the subject, like realigning their behaviors and values, normally takes place in two general ways. One, this is actively pursued by society and by institutions, by punishing the ones who deviate from the norm. For example, they can be institutionalized or put into jail or correctional centers, or rewarding the individuals that instead align in particular clear and efficient ways to the kind of behaviors, giving out prizes, right, or putting them in position of power. This is, for example, the case in religion, with guiding Christians to sin less or teaching soldiers to march better, and so on and so forth. This is very crudely behavioristic. It's something that we will see in class 2 or 3 of this series. And there's also a passive way in which society normalizes behaviors, values, attitudes, and so on, which is, as I was mentioning already, by sheer force of repetition and example, presenting certain role models and valuing them through television, for example, giving examples of virtuous behavior through the repetition of these ideas and values in cultural products, including video games. So, whereas in the active part, the society is in a way like aware of what they're trying to promote, passively, this happens in an almost unthinking way. The repetition, easy for me to say, the repetition and iteration of social and cultural tropes are nothing else but passive repetition of existing ideologies. So folk tales, for example, or mainstream movies do nothing but repeat and reinforce the status quo. This is highlighted with great clarity by Joseph Campbell in his book The Hero with 1,000 Faces, where the author shows how the monomyth, so the myth of the hero, is something that is transcultural, so it's present in all world culture, and it tends to be like a device to inculcate and teach certain values by which an ideal society should work. If you think about Anakin Skywalker or Jesus Christ or similar other monomyths that you might be familiar with, you certainly know that what they try to show is that anybody can in a way aspire to a great degree of heroism or positivity in society. And in general, the ones that are considered to be heroes embody certain social behaviors such as selflessness, honesty, purity, and so on and so forth. So you can see how those, like in folk tales and religious mythologies, tend to have very similar behaviors and very similar functions, that of regulating and controlling society, uniforming it to a certain societal standards. It is only natural then that cultures that base themselves on the same mythologies and the same texts, so to speak, tend to have very similar understanding of what is good behavior, what is a family, what is a good life, and so on and so forth. More recent, the role of mythology has been taken over by other media, which are not just orality or text, as it's been in the past, let's say, moments of our civilization. And of course, there's many texts that you can read and that explain how ideology and media manage to form what society is right now. If you read, for example, Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky or Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, you will have a clear idea of what I'm talking about. This is not necessarily the key, the crux of this class, but at least something that I would like you to think about. And also quite normal, quite natural for you, it should be right now, of making a comparison with the kind of myths and values that you play as a player and you design as a designer. So as a cultural product, there's some meaning making also in the new-ish medium that we love and care for and design for. Video games and virtual worlds function in a very similar way to other media, which is they become the lieu where ideologies are repeated and normalized, or maybe even subverted, which is going to be a crucial aspect of this course. What I've been saying also, must to a degree resonate with what you just saw in this class, like that 1988 movie, They Live. Clearly, there's more to that movie than I presented to you right now, and I would like you to know more about it and have a clear idea on how ideology is represented within that movie. I promised more would come and more explanation about that movie and ideologies. And who better than Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek to explain that? I prepared, or rather, I would like to communicate that to you through a video once again, but I cannot post the entirety of the video again because that would not be legal. But I'm going to ask you to stop this movie again, the one that you're watching, the one in which I'm talking, and instead go to this link, which you also find in the description below, and watch 6 minutes of Žižek explaining how ideology is represented in that particular movie. And with, more detail and more interesting little tangents as he always does. Please enjoy. And so hopefully you've seen, I hope you enjoyed the video, and freedom hurts, says Žižek. An ideology, when applied to the individual and individual life, he says, is not an artificial way to be. It is just the way things are. It is perfectly natural. Žižek points out that this is not an artificial way to be ideological, but it's our spontaneous relationship to the world. It gives the world order. It puts a frame onto it by which it is possible to claim that something is correct or incorrect, legal or illegal, desirable or undesirable. Žižek even goes as far as saying that we get pleasure from the safety that ideologies and the stability that ideologies give us. As society, through media and other social institutions, rituals and so on and so forth, normalize values into habits and routine, it is only normal that it's hard for us to get unshackled from them, that we can get out of it, that we can perform a criticism, because we are normally so immersed in it that we do not even see that we live in according to certain values, that we are indoctrinated in certain ways. As Žižek would say, I'm already eating rubbish, right? So he concludes his video by saying that given how difficult it is, one needs to be forced to be free of ideology. And there's no place to be free from ideology, but at least he says we need to attain a critical position towards it, at least becoming aware of it, like wearing the glasses in the case of John Nada. Now, I don't want to go into much more depth now, but if you, like me, are fascinated by these ideas, there is going to be a bonus video at the end of this lecture. You will not have to watch it. However, if these are interesting and important points for you, like how do we live? Why do we form certain beliefs and so on? Then there's going to be a video that I suggest that you watch. It's going to be an half-an-hour video that is completely optional. You're not going to be asked about it in class, but please do it. It's by David Foster Wallace, and it is deeply about very similar topics of ideology. It's titled "This is Water," and it was a commencement speech for a college in 2005. I'm going to wait a second, let you read the quote, and move to the next slide in a few seconds. To repeat once again, ideologies are ideas accepted and proposed by the dominant class of a society that are then shared by its members in ways that are often implicit. In the coming few slides, I will look at video games in particular, given the fact that the course is an experimental game design course and we start from a very theoretical distance, in a way quite removed from the normal discussion on video games. But as you know, this is of my interest. This is very crucial for me to start looking at video games at contexts in which ideologies are, one, present, two, can be in a way reshaped or put into a critical position, or three, one in which you can be forced out of your comfort, forced to realize certain things, or as Zizek would say, places where in a way you can be forced to be free in different ways. Let's check them out. The following games that I'm presenting are characterized by the fact that ideologies are quite explicitly thrown in the face of the players. It is the case, for example, of Duerte Fighting Crime, where this game obviously make satire of the very hard attitude that the Filipino president Duterte had against drug dealing and crimes in the streets. So in this case, ideologies are presented here explicitly as a form of satire. So this one was a satirical game that proposes that the common current status quo ideology in the Philippines are ridiculous and should be criticized. Another explicitly ideological game is Corbin Run, which is an infinite runner that, again, like almost satirically and definitely in your face, presents values of the British society and how politics are dealing with them in a non-necessarily very satisfactory or particularly ethical way. In this case, was a game made by some people I know to promote the Corbyn's campaign of a few years back. Sadly, that didn't win. Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and we all know how that went down. Among explicit ideologies, also we see Papers, Please as a good example, I think, because in a way the various ideologies under which you're supposed to behave as a player are presented to you at the beginning of each section of gameplay. So every day that you go back as a let's say border patrol person to your booth are given to you in an explicit fashion. These people can go through, these other people can go through, only people with work can go through, and so on and so forth. So this game explicitly presents political ideologies, and it's left then to the players to accept them, reject them, change their opinion about them, and so on and so forth. But they are presented quite explicitly, quite literally, I would say. They're front-loaded before each gaming session. There are also games in which ideologies are present implicitly. So the player is never confronted openly with the fact that video games are ideological contexts or ideological constructs. An example of that is, well, just to make a very, very clear example, Super Mario, right? There's many ideological positions that are silent in Super Mario, but we are still, as player, asked to act under them. For example, I am right in taking vengeance on creatures that allegedly did me wrong, like normally that wrongdoing consists on having kidnapped Princess Peach or an equivalent kind of affront, so to speak. So the game asks you to pursue your revenge and set the world right, regardless of the amount of victims that you will leave in your way and the amount of destruction. At the same time, the game values collection of resources, in this case coins that represent this universal equivalent, like a resource that can become any other resource. So the game values the individual point of view as the privileged one. So I was wounded, I was hurt by this action, so it's my duty now to retaliate. And secondly, as opposed to say like asking the police or talking to the state and so on and so forth. And secondly is a game about accumulation of resources. The player, in a way, by playing Super Mario, not only should already be intuitively familiar with the idea that accumulating resources is good. After all, this is how we are brought up in our capitalistic societies, but also is reinforced to do so, because the more you accumulate, the more possibilities you will have to play gambling minigames or buying tools that are going to be useful for your pursuits. So if Super Mario is a very capitalistic game, even in disguise, like it's cute and everything, but ultimately it's very individualistic and capitalistic, a very similar reflection we can propose in the case of The Sims here, which is one of the biggest selling franchises in the world, same as Super Mario. And it is presented as a life simulation game, or rather a game that, by letting the player control a number of avatars of little Sims or simulated people, mimics social life. The very idea of The Sims is that, I mean, from the title even, we can tell that the aspiration, or rather the construct here, is presented as a simulation, not a parody, for example. The world of The Sims 3 thus presumably simulates or reflects the ideologies that are present in everyday life, right? And also those of their makers. Among other things in this kind of game, in The Sims, the acquisition of money, goods and popularity are the main processes through which the Sims achieve and maintain happiness, which is, let's call it like the most important currency of the game. Like implicitly it's successful. A successful Sim is a happy Sim, right? Without happiness, the Sim will fall into disregard, madness, loneliness, sadness, and so on and so forth. The troubling part in the implicit ideology here is that it is referring to itself as a simulation of social life, right? Like, but that's not quite true. Like, you cannot decide what to be in The Sims. You cannot be, say, a Somali pirate or a nun or a hermit living on top of a mountain, or part of a, I don't know, nomadic group, like, for example, the Sinti. What they do instead is like present that as social life, not as a subset of social life, not as a tiny sliver, particularly like American suburban capitalistic vision of what is a good life, but as the good life. In The Sims, these are the mechanics according to which the players can acquire and maintain happiness. There's more than what I'm listing here. Among other things, you can list personal hygiene and so on and so forth. But what The Sims present as a successful good life is the following. A life that has money, which is normally accomplished by having a Sim job. So quite naturally, the game reinforces the idea that you need to have a job to be a functioning citizen, and money as a consequences. With money, you can possess a house and buy goods. The price here, the higher quality of these goods, the better for maintaining and keeping happiness. Popularity is another factor for what concerns happiness in The Sims. So having many friends, many connections, being the center of a network of relationship and having a high reputation contributes to your happiness. So let me repeat once again. The Sims, by doing that, does not reference or simulate social life per se, but a very specific, historically positioned, also geographically positioned kind of life that, in a way, we could identify with a successful capitalistic life in the West, in the US in particular, but it's very hard to make a difference between how the US behave and, say, France behaves. Perhaps the difference is more quantitative than qualitative. Similar example of implicit ideologies in video games, and if you remember my class on ideo games, this is another example that I already mentioned, can be found in SimCity, another game by Maxis, the producers of, or in a way that people who are also involved in the production of The Sims. My friend Paolo Pedercini, the artist behind the critical games of Molla Industria, also looked at SimCity as a lieu, as a context of ideology, and he presents to the public. He argues that although SimCity presents itself as a simulator of any city, and in a way, in the way it's marketed, it is proposed as the possibility to fulfill your dream as a city maker, that freedom is an illusion, because for the game to actually work properly, for you to be able to maintain a city and to make it flourish as a player, you will need to do certain activities. You will need to align to certain understanding of economics that will make you always end up with Phoenix, Arizona, says Paolo. That's the only type of city you can create in the game, which is the modernist, car-centered, grid-based North American city. Now, similar to the previous example, we're going to go into tiny little details about how the game's mechanic and the game's affordances, in a way, propose, normalize, and keep iterating on these values. The ways in which citizen happiness is programmed in SimCity, at least the latest versions that we tested, needs a perpetually growing economy, and jobs. If I'm not mistaken, in general, I think taxation needs to be maximum around 13%, or the risk is that of economic stagnation. In other words, what the game implies is that a successful city operates under entrepreneurial capitalism. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I mentioned here, taxation needs to be low, around 12%, to be able for entrepreneur and industry to flourish, meaning that you will not be able, as a player, to construct, say, a socialist city. The natural environment is presented as uninhabited. It is presented as a set of modules which are pre-packaged and ready for exploitation. So the game does not, in a way, propose the idea that space is something that we share with other creatures. Maybe endangered worms are not represented, or the birds that nest in that location, or the kind of swamp ecology that goes on there. Neither it presents those spaces, like the lots of lands on which you can build as a player on SimCity, as having been pre-inhabited. They don't have archaeological sites. They don't have rural people working there. They are presented as pre-packaged, neutral, identity-less spaces for human use, which is already kind of twisted and weird. Paolo Pedercini also points out that in his experiments he tried to also make ring cities and garden cities, but for the same reasons I highlighted above, those were impossible projects to pursue. We could go on and on. There's actually a couple of very good papers about the ideologies that are implicit in SimCity. But let me conclude for now, not to get into too much detail, that SimCity as a game implicitly encourages endless growth without confronting the player with the scarcity of resources, the presence of animal life or previous civilization layers, so to speak, or the viability of possible political and economical alternatives. Also in class number 3, I think it was, or 4, ideal games, I would like to present a particular mechanic in a particular installment of SimCity. In this case, we're talking about 2013. So in this particular installment of SimCity, I'm going to take a sip of water. Sorry about that. This is better. In that particular installment of SimCity, a new mechanic is introduced that was never present before 2013. This mechanic is called homelessness. Now, as you can see from this screenshot, many kind of yellow icons are populating the city in question. Again, a grid-like, heavily built kind of American city. Those icons represent homeless people. Homeless people in this version of the game flood into your city from a nameless outside. So they actually pour in from outside the system that is simulated. We are not necessarily confronted with where they're coming from, or what generated that, but we know that functionally they increase in number if a city is dirtier, and they also increase its number the less our cities are patrolled by police. So in a way to get rid of the homeless in SimCity 2013, the player is requested to keep the city clean and keep the city patrolled. Once the player has done that, the homeless people, those tiny annoying icons, which are also very damaging for the player because they lower the value of real estate, will be pushed out of the system. We don't know where they will go. So you see that the way in which homeless people are metaphorized in this game is as something more similar to, say, pests, rodents, or an infection than actual people. And their presence is not confronted as a socioeconomic problem. So the fact that joblessness and desperation and the lack of social safety and social, what is the safety nets, so to speak, are not present in a society, but they're just presented as annoyances that can be in a way mitigated with some, let's say, punctual and individual solutions, to the point that they leave the city and you don't need to worry about them anymore. But again, the player is not confronted with when they go next. Are they reabsorbed into society or simply removed from the city by policemen? This particular mechanic troubled a friend of mine, Matteo Bittanti, who wrote a 600-page epic about this very mechanic called How to Get Rid of Homeless, in which not only he explains this mechanic in minute detail, but also in his 2014 book interviews some of the developers who cannot quite come to terms with why that vision is not acceptable or politically problematic. After all, of course, the developers at Maxis are affluent people, well-educated people from the Bay Area, in which, by their own words, the presence of homeless is bothersome, unsanitary, and also, as I mentioned already, lowers the value of real estate in the city. So you understand that that particular book highlights an ideological problem that is implicit not only to the player, so this is never presented as a problem of an infestation of rats, but is like masked as a problem with the homeless, but is also implicit in the way that the designers designed the game. They are not themselves aware of what they're done and the message they are in a way pushing out in the form of digital interaction, a virtual world. This is like a great example of what I mean, that virtual worlds are ideological contexts and ideological constructs, right? And it's also a great example of the implicitness of those ideologies, both from the player side. We never quite informed about many things about what's happening and never quite presented with homelessness as a problem beyond getting rid of them, and from the point of view of the designers. To summarize and make a point, or like in a way more systematic point about ideologies in games, I would like to propose you a little list of the ways in which ideologies are communicated and reinforced in games. I don't imagine the list to be exhaustive, but it's general enough that perhaps you can relate to it in a way that is helpful. The aesthetic representation of game elements is the first point that comes to mind, and it is discussed in a very eloquent manner by Soraya Murray on her book on video games, The Visual Politics of Race, Gender, and Space. So she makes a very fine point in which, like, the very representation of game characters and elements already carry ideological and political messages. As we saw in many games that were already presented, for example, in the case of Papers, Please or Super Mario, narration plays a role in framing event situations and in setting goals and aspirations for the players. The idea that game boundaries and limitations, not only the spatial ones, but also the ones that have to do with the possibility of doing within these kind of worlds, are certainly an important part of how ideologies become interactive in video game worlds. This has been discussed, for example, by Ian Bogost in many of his publications, but also by my friend Riccardo Fassone in one book in particular called Every Game is an Island, Ending and Extremities in Video Games. For both authors, the presence of limitations in where you can go and what you can do already constitute the ideological positioning of the designers towards the player. It's that particular very brutal, very basic way in which the designer says, I want this and not that. You should do this and not that. You can go here but not there, and so on. Player affordances, again, another way to say it, the possibilities to manipulate the environment and to interact with it, again, work as a kind of interdiction. Something can be done, something is possible, and something is not. Clearly, then, as we will see later, we will have a class just about that. Players can decide to rebel against these kind of limitations and can decide to unplay or play the game beyond those affordances. We will see how. This is not necessarily the point where I would like to do that, but I think this should be featured in the list. So boundaries and affordances are like very basic, very fundamental designer tools to inscribe and inject ideologies into game worlds. And of course, prelusory goals and player feedback, the way in which aesthetically and functionally the designer says, yes, well done, and this is the way to do it, this was an appropriate behavior, this was an appropriate response, is also part of this rhetorical package that we call video game. Examples of games that are deliberately rhetorical, so that they internalize what ideologies are and in a way found a way to twist them on the head and offer the player a critical relationship with those very ideologies that are normally represented in games, is offered by Molindustria in a number of different games, and I will cite a lot of those. In this case, the screenshot presented here is about one of the most, in my opinion, clever and salient games that he's developed, called The Best Amendment, which is an unofficial NRA, which is National Rifle Association game about gun control, tactical shooting, and the fourth dimensional thinking. He's referring here to the Fourth Amendment. Another example could be Cart Life by Richard Hofmeyer, winning of many indie prizes. In Cart Life, the player takes the role of several immigrants, like it's made in episodes, so to speak. And in all of these episodes, the player is served a slice of reality. Right? It's in a way is one of those games in which we are forced to change our perspectives and we are confronted with something uncomfortable and that we don't want to wear, very much like John Nada's Best Friend. And sometimes it hurts to play these kind of games. Mechanics make us uncomfortable and make us do repetitive, uninteresting things, and perhaps on occasions we would like to stop playing these games and rebel against it and just not feel that degree of discomfort. As I was saying, Cart Life serves the player a slice of reality. It is an examination of the world through the eyes of a cart vendor and then other immigrants. It doesn't sound too exciting, right? But that's kind of the point. You are confronted with the everyday life of somebody who struggles, whose life is miserable, repetitive, unsatisfactory, and an unforeseen problem is a tragedy. When you're not part of a social system, when you don't have social security, when you cannot make enough money to live and eat and not afford, say, healthcare, then different problems might arise. And the player might be will be asked to confront those situations, which are neither spectacular nor heroic, and very uncomfortable, and sometimes very boring and repetitive and colorless. These kind of games present a reality which is not exciting, feedback which is not exhilarating, and behaviors which are very mundane. And again, the idea here is not to get you excited, not to get you hooked as a player, but get you to see what other aspects of living in this world are like. Yes, there are fantasies, but there's also reality. Can we play with reality, and how would we play with reality? What does it mean to get bored and discomforted by this game? I was about to say by this book, but then again, it's a rhetorical feature that we can find in other media forms, of course. I could make many other examples. In the Parable of the Polygons by Nicky Case, the designer explains us through, again, rhetorical devices how our cities are constructed and why we think it's normal that certain groups of people are segregated from others. Another game by the Molindustria, the McDonald's video games, show what kind of ideologies, and again, very uncomfortably so, regulate and direct the behavior and the strategical choices of a corporation such as the McDonald's video game. And you are left to wonder whether that is ketchup or blood, right? Many of his games make you very uncomfortable and show like a very uncomfortable reality, or at least an interpretation that is supposed to make it, at least to a degree, uncomfortable and reflect on our own ideology. In this case, we can call these games critical games because they force you in a position as a player to take a stance, to be shocked, or to actually operate as a negative element in a certain society. And that position is not normally what other games that fulfill our fantasies ask us to fulfill. It's not a role that other games ask us to take. And being discomforted in that particular way, being informed in that particular way, being convinced in that particular way is a relatively new use of computer interactions. I think that we could, I mean, from the advertisement point of view, as Bogus posits it, we can go back 20, 25 years, but the social use of games is something fairly recent. I would say no sooner than 20 years ago. I also made a small game. As you know, I make games that explain things and make philosophical points, but the thing is that this one in particular makes a point about the ideologies of game making. In that sense, they are self-reflexive or self-critical. So the ideologies they put into discussion, the ideologies they highlight, are about the very medium through which the ideology is delivered. If you're my students, you already played this game, so you probably relate to it. Otherwise, that's the link that you can click in case you wanted to play my self-critical game. Not particularly important to this point, but just showing you that there are games of these kinds as well. To conclude this first class, each of them will take about an hour, and we're 52 minutes through at this point. So to conclude this point, I would like to highlight the ideas that are crucial to this initial session, which is video games, similar to other media forms, disclose and contain ideologies. So they are the lieu, the context in which we can be indoctrinated, but also in which ideologies can be subverted, new values can be experimented and proposed. In particular, computer games, or let me say like virtual worlds in general, sometimes more frequently than not, those are playful kind of virtual worlds, but that is not necessarily the case for everyone. Video games are just the sort of the most salient, most culturally present form in which we currently consume, produce, interact with virtual worlds. But I lost my track of thought. So what I was trying to say is that ideologies in virtual worlds and games are generally communicated by a number of different elements, which we, in direct or indirect ways, we examine throughout the past probably 20 slides. The ways in which ideologies are communicated are both aesthetic, in terms of the representation of game elements, the use of interfaces and colors, and the ways humans are represented, and so on and so forth, through narration, and narration normally also includes a context where our actions make sense, and they normally introduce goals and objectives for the players. Goals and objectives for the players are set by the designers with particular goals in mind and particular behaviors to pursue them in mind, meaning that they also are highly ideological tools. Last but not least, we talked about boundaries, limitations, and affordances as the most basic tools for the designers to communicate their intention and the desired behavior that they want from the players. If you are familiar and happy and clear with all of these ideas, then the first class was successful, in my opinion, in presenting video games as telescopes for the mind. So what's next? The last thing that I wanted to talk to you about was, well, that optional video that I recommended and that I would like you to watch in case you have the time and the interest. The video is from one of my favorite writers, David Foster Wallace, and was recorded in 2005. Then the illustrations you will see are more recent, but that doesn't matter, and it's a commencement speech at a US college. This is the address, and I will put it in the description of this video so that you can easily access that. I would really recommend you to watch it because it touches on very many points that this initial session included and featured. Last but not least, as I was saying, last but not least, in case you are taking this course not for pleasure, but because you're part of a course on experimental game design, that does not exclude that you can also have pleasure with it, by the way, then I would recommend you to play this game. It's available on Steam, and it should be available, yes, and it's called Oki Blocks, and it came out originally in 2015. The reason why I would like you to watch it is that we are going to do a small assignment about that one. However, if you're not following the course, it's pointless for me to explain the assignment at this point, and I leave that for a live session in case you're following this course as part of my IDG 5252 course. So I leave that for later, and well, I think this is almost the end of it. I hope this class was clear to you and that already helped in setting the tone for the entirety of the course. I'm going to record a few more classes as the days go by, and hopefully this is an interesting course for you. I think it's very crucial that we start thinking about games, virtual worlds, and a wider set of digital technologies in ways that are ideological, not only as source of imposed behaviors and values, but also as the places where we could leverage change. I hope you agree with that. I hope you enjoyed it, and well, until the next one.